Good morning, afternoon, and evening. This is John Ramos MTG here, affiliated with TSN 10th Street News. We are going to start a new series. This new series is going to be called So You Want to Main. And So You Want to Main is basically how Titan Smash, what's going on? So You Want to Main is basically how I'm going to start doing content here. And how it all came to be is I basically have been watching and getting ideas, not stealing content from streamers, but seeing what people are doing, and I'm trying to find out what everybody is not doing. My dad used to tell me all the time that in order to be successful, you see what everybody's doing. Your family, your friends, your coworkers, everyone. You see what they're doing and don't do what they do. So what is everyone doing? Well, what I noticed is that everyone in the saturated market of Twitch and YouTube is that everyone is doing what most people do. And the most people doing are or what they're doing is they do a deck tech, they talk about matchups, they talk about sideboard strategies, cards and all that. And then they do some matches and then that's the end. Well, what don't they do? Well, they don't talk about what they don't talk about is individual matchups, and they don't talk about sideboard strategy and how the deck is operated and talk about individual matchups or the history of it or why they play it and what specifically you're trying to target, even on the ladder or in tourney play, and then kind of like mold a list together that targets a specific metagame that you're trying to target. And just because you're playing it in a tournament doesn't mean that the list is going to be the same in a in a tourney or on the ladder, because they're both different and they play differently. On the ladder, you got to win all your games, and in the tournament, same thing, except the metagame is much smaller. All right, but how the history of the deck is basically I started with Forsaken Monument, and I remembered from JRR2 or John Roberts. You can find him on JRR2 at Twitter or at Twitter, and he also streams same content, same name. And his list in Historic before Amonkhet, before Kaladesh, all that, was using Renowned Weaponsmith and trying to cast Golos on turn 3. Well, when I saw Forsaken Monument costing the same, I figured, well, what if we just cut all of the excess colors and just play blue? And I put all that together. Obviously, we're not in that anymore because Kaladesh and Amonkhet basically changed the whole format. But that's where I started, went to Historic Open and took second with it. And then I started evolving the list from there. And then Ali Antrazi and Mythic Meebo or Ali Warfield were both playing a strictly colorless version, both different lists when Amonkhet released, and you have, or no, excuse me, Jumpstart, not Amonkhet, and they were playing with Mind Stones and Guardian Idols with Hedron Archives and doing this colorless route. Ali Antrazi was playing Power Stone Shard, and Ali Warfield wasn't. So I kind of like mixed the two. And then I found some contentions in the list, and then I started evolving it by playing a crap ton of Historic. So fast forward to today, this is the new list. The old list that I played, we day two'd in the Kaladesh or SEG Kalheim qualifier, the satellites. We went 4-2. I punted game 1 in the last match. And then I got steamrolled in game 2. But if I don't punt in game 1, I'm pretty sure we go to game 3. But either way, we went 4-2. And then in the day 2 qualifier on Sunday, excuse me, this past Sunday, we start out 2-0, beating both Jund decks, one that has company, one that does not. And then we proceeded to go 0-3 against basically decks that we weren't targeting. That happens in tournament play, but I'm still evolving the list. But why are we playing it? The reason you're playing it is not so much for Forsaken Monument, but because your list dodges basically almost most of the format. All right, you don't get trashed by Fatal Push. You don't get trashed by Aether Gust, color specific cards, that are being played main deck. So you don't really have to worry too much about it. You're not dying to Rest in Peace or Digger's Cage. You're basically dodging all of the hate in the format while also kind of like playing this ramp strategy that doesn't die to creature removal. And since your ramp spells are spell based, but typically you're not getting spell pierced or negated as much because those aren't played in heavy quantities in game ones. Some do, but some don't. So that's why we play it. And you are very, very well suited in the metagame right now. And I still think that it's because the metagame isn't shifting that hard that you're still doing what you want to do. You're not being slowed down by much. And we'll get into the individual card choices. Yeah, I'm going to get to that. So the individual card choices are as follows. I'm not going to go through everything, but I'm going to go through the very specific, things that I've changed and where we're at. So Digger's Cage is one that is giving the most contention in best of one and best of three. I don't play best of one, but I know players that do. And I'm pretty sure that this is more main deckable in best of one than it is in best of three. And the reason why you're playing Cage is because creature cards in graveyards and libraries can't enter the battlefield, meaning that you can't reanimate spells, you can't collect the company, you can't play Bolus's Citadel, Experimental Frenzy, stuff like that. All right. If there's anything that pulls from the library or the graveyard in a creature, it's not entering the battlefield, and it only costs 1. So you can cast this on turn 1, you can cast this on turn 2 after you cast Mind Stone. Turn 3, if you're casting Guardian Idol and you go into Hedron Archive and cast it. So you have a lot of ways to kind of like pick your spots where you want Cage in it. But this basically forces all of the decks that are trying to play unfair strategies and forces them to play fair. Goblins can't combo kill you on turn 3 if you have this out. They just get a 4/4 for 6. Now, granted, it gets bigger, but they're not putting 4, 5, 6 goblins into play. And this also stops them from, basically you controlling the whole game and then they just slam Muxus on turn 5, turn 6 and kill you. You get to control the game with this. This also bodes well against, not saying that goblins is a favorable matchup, but this forces them to basically tie one arm behind their back and basically play an aggro game, which you're suited for. And then this also stops a lot of what Jund Sacrifice and Rakdos Sacrifice are doing, because they can't just keep getting back Cat and a bunch of other creatures from the graveyard. They can activate Cat, but it just doesn't enter the battlefield. And Collected Company, same thing. You just don't get to play a refuel card and draw 2, but put them directly into play. It stops Aetherworks Marvel, which I think is a trap anyways. You can't Ultimatum, Genesis Ultimatum, and there's a lot of stuff that you just don't get. And Digger's Cage just basically stops all that. All right. And you're playing it main deck because there's not a lot of interaction for this card in game 1. And then there's spots where you side it out when you know they're going to bring in hate for you. And usually you're using that in a open decklist tournament. And on the ladder, it just depends on what tier you're in. I started with 3 Maze Mind Tomes. I'm down to 1. And the reason why I keep cutting this card is not because it's bad, but because the format is getting more efficient and faster. This card is only as good as slow as the format, meaning that if you're casting this on turn 2, what are you doing that is not the same as Guardian Idol or Mind Stone? You're basically taking a turn off to get an advantage. Your only saving grace on this card is at the fact that the most popular deck in the format, which isn't the best, but the most popular deck in the format plays Thoughtseize, and that's Sultai. But you don't want 3 of these for a match that you're only going to see once, maybe twice out of 6 or 7 matches. So you only want to see this once or twice at minimum. And the second time is usually when you're getting it out of the sideboard, all right, with Karn the Great Creator. So I've cut it down to one because you're playing against aggro a lot more, and taking turnoffs against aggro is not where you want to be at. You want to get to Extinction Event and your higher casting cost spells as fast as possible, especially when a lot of aggro decks now are taking an approach of having a strong turn clock, and while also playing disruption. So you want to be able to two spell them as many times as possible. I was at 3 Extinction Events. Now I'm at 4. There's so much aggro and so many cards that this deals with. There's no reason not to play 4 in the main anymore. Any less than 4 anyways. I had one in the sideboard because I wasn't on the ladder. I wasn't facing a lot of aggro. But given that you get dumpstered by small or even medium creature decks, there's no reason not to play 4 of these. And this incidentally hits Nissalands and Uro. So this basically hits whatever you want. And the aggro decks that are playing BTE, which I don't think are the best, this hits all that. So, and doing it on turn 3 is a big deal. So, excuse me. Hedron Archive is just a ramp spell. I'm almost to the point where I'm going to cut this down to 3. But we're trying it out at 4 again. So your big name spells are pretty simple. Ulamog is just your get out of jail free card along with Ugin being at 10 and 8 spells, or casting cost spells anyway. And what you're trying to do with them is just leverage them. Ugin is for the aggro and the mid-range matchups, and Ulamog is for the Sultai matchup. And we'll get to the sideboard strategies of both these cards and the contention in some of the lists that were played this past weekend. I'm playing one baby Ugin. I started at 3. I haven't played more than 1 in a fairly long time in the last couple weeks. Started at 3. I made it all the way down to 1. And the reason being is that just because it's 6 casting costs doesn't mean it gets you anywhere. 6 casting costs, removal spells, or generating 2/2s, sometimes 4/4s, is good, but it's not the end all be all. And you only want to see this once. You don't want to see it many more times. So having it at 1 is kind of like where you're at, and ramping into this and getting Ulamog next turn is good, but it's not good all the time. So you only want to see this once. But the main crux of the deck is leveraging I think the 3 best cards in the deck, and that's Monument, Golos, and Karn. I've gone to 2 because in this past weekend, this card is just basically, I don't know any way to say it, but this card's basically your contention point at 5 mana if you just not happen to draw Forsaken Monument and you don't know what to get with Karn. And if you're trying not to play this on turn 4, sometimes you don't want to. And Golos kind of leverages that point where decks are playing negate, so you just kind of like get around them by playing Golos. And this gets you more mana, and it draws 3 cards. Just remember, when you're going to spin this guy or activate him, don't play your land first, unless you're going to spin it the turn that you drop your land. So you need 8 mana to make this work. I know it says 7, but you have Cascading Cataracts, and you need to tap this to add the 5. So ensure that you can count to 8, because sometimes you might miss it, and just because you have 7 mana, but it's not all colored mana, so you're not going to be able to produce Wulberg plus 2. You need Cascading Cataracts plus 5, and then the 2 to activate. So, but the reason why I think this is good is having a 3/5 that sometimes gets a 5/7 for 5 and get you a land that isn't always Cascading Cataracts, and generating some value while also to attack, and blocks very well too, and doesn't die to push ever, or doesn't get claim to Firstborn and stuff like that. And sometimes you have this, and all their creatures on the opposing side are even, so it gets around Extinction Event sometimes too. But having this type of effect in your deck that you don't have to play as many Maze Mind Tomes to draw cards, this is basically how you do it. And you can do it at any point in the turn and cast them at any point, and it doesn't matter if they're creatures or sorcery speed spells, because you can cast them at any time. As long as you've activated this, you can cast them at any time. And Forsaken Monument is obviously the crux of the whole deck with Karn, in that all of your lands besides the swamps, and I'll get to that, tap for an additional color, so that you double your mana with Forsaken Monument. All of your creatures turn into 4/4s or bigger, because all colorless creatures, not just artifacts, but colorless creatures get +2/+2. And every time you cast a colorless spell, which is your whole deck besides Extinction Event and the sideboard, you're gaining 2 life. There are so many times where you can 2 or 3 spell and go from 6 life to 12 life and put yourself out of reach, even against Embercleave decks. This card is just fantastic. I think is also possibly better than Nissa, but that's saying a lot. And then Karn. Karn is just very good. And it's why you play the deck the way you do. But this is the contention point that most people don't get. On the ladder, I can see where you having more of a wish board than what I'm playing. However, in tournament play, your targets are a lot smaller than on the ladder. On the ladder is more open, so you probably want more sideboard slots. But if you're building your sideboard to be as flexible as possible, then you don't need that many slots. This is basically just an extra Forsaken Monument, an extra Golos, an extra Maze Mind Tome, an extra cage when you need it, and vice versa. And then the activated ability stops Jund. It stops the mirror, or not the activated ability, excuse me, the static ability. Activated abilities of artifacts your opponents control can't be activated. It doesn't matter if they're mana abilities or not. It stops the mirror, stops Jund, stops Rakdos with their combo or their synergy package with Witch's Oven, and they can't activate their food tokens to gain 3 life. They can activate Cat still, but if you have Cage out, they can't bring Cat into play. But Karn can sometimes turn your otherwise useless mana rocks into creatures, and it blocks well, goes to 6 if you need to, still stays at 3, and yeah, it's all around. These 3, 4s, and 5s are just so good, and that's why you play them. Now, what about the sideboard? All right, so this past weekend there was one deck that was playing basically the same package I am, but they went 7-2, and they were playing a much more wish board than I am. Their deck was playing Flame Sweep, which is an interesting take on it. But I felt that if you're already playing Cage and your aggro matchup that you're scared of most is Goblins, if you're already playing with Cage, then I don't understand why you need if you need Flame Sweep when it's not as flexible as Cry is. My contention is that this kills more and deals with more than Flame Sweep does, in that the Exile Clause matters, and you can get your mana base to where you can cast this reliably and not force yourself to, make sure that your mana base casts red spells even though they're not playing any red lands. But the fact that you're, branching off into a different color for no other reason than you want an instant when you otherwise wouldn't, and doesn't deal with as much of the format as Cry does, I think I'm not saying it's wrong, but I'm going to test Cry over Flame Sweep. They're playing 3, but they weren't playing as many Thought Seizes. They weren't playing any, and they were playing more of a wish board with 1-ofs and 2-ofs. I cut a lot of the 1-ofs because the format is so efficient and fast that your wish board, by the time you even attempt to cast anything, it's on turn 4, and sometimes turn 5 because you're playing Karn on turn 3 or Extinction Event on turn 3, and then Karn on turn 4 or Forsaken Monument on turn 4, and you don't start doing anything until then. So a lot of the wish targets don't matter. Like, they don't mean anything. The targets that matter are to stop the opposing decks. Cage stops a lot of the format. Sentinel Totem stops the other half of the format. And then Maze Mind Tome gets you back into the game if you're playing against control that plays a lot of discard spells. The rest of it is kind of like either your win conditions or the way to take over the game. You don't need reactive spells in your deck if you don't need them. You want to be as proactive as possible with plans. So that's basically how I built my sideboard. You don't have to go that way, but that's the way I built mine. Now, but Thoughtseize is probably the most flexible card in the deck in that you can put it in against anything and it'll be fine. But mostly this is for the control matchups where you cut a lot of your bad cards, and that's Grafdigger's Cage and Extinction Event. And if you're cutting Cage, you need something else to recoup that loss. So you side in your Mystic Forges. And then against aggro, obviously you add more removal with Cry the Carnarium and stuff like that. So we're gonna get into the mana base here, and you can see it's a lot different than most others, and that's because I am anticipating a lot of changes. So Sultai is a good matchup for you, but they're starting to run a lot of Assassin's Trophies. And Blue-Eye Control is starting to run Field of Ruins, and other decks are too. And so I didn't want to be stone cold dead to any of that. So that's why there's swamps in the deck. I started at 1, and then if I'm adding Cry the Carnariums, since it's double black, I need more black sources. So that's why I added more swamps. I also added a Mirrodin's Core to add the 16th black source that I can cast on turn 3 if I don't have an artifact that I can't tap Spire of Industry for. So that's kind of like the contention here. That means that you have to give up on something, and that was Interplanar Beacon. And sometimes you just don't need the life. And most of the time, if you're at a low life total, you're going to die anyways. And Forsaken Monument is what you're trying to use anyway. So since Interplanar Beacon is probably your least flexible land, in that if near deadlands can kill a creature in a pinch, Aether Hub Taps is probably the other one that's close to Planar Beacon, but Planar Beacon doesn't tap for colored mana, which Aether Hub does. And then we also cut Zephyrin Void, because scrying most of the time is not as important as just taking draw steps. And you kind of mess up your top of your deck sometimes when you do it. So we just took that decision out of the deck and added a Scavenger Grounds. This wasn't in here. I've had this before, but that was only because there was a lot more graveyard decks than there are now. But the rise of blue-white gifts is forcing me to add an additional way to interact with the graveyard besides just my my Sentinel Totem. And as an addition, most decks are playing Tormod's Crypt, and the reason why I'm playing Sentinel Totem is because while it costs 1 more than Tormod's Crypt does, this exiles my graveyard also. And if you read Karn, it says the minus ability says you may reveal an artifact card you own from outside the game, which counts as your sideboard, or choose a face-up card or artifact card you own in exile. So if you have if you exile Maze Mind Tome from the triggered ability, if somebody Agonizing Remorses you, if you exile your own graveyard, I'm pretty sure this also works with Kitesail Freebooter if they take it from you. As long as it's face up, you get to grab it. So Karn basically stops all that. So if like somebody exiles something from you and you don't know how to get it back, this is how you get it. And then you don't have to target yourself with Sentinel Totem. It just exiles everything. All right. While also exiling the opponent's graveyard. So this comes in. I haven't wished for this yet, but against the GPG decks, this is probably going to get used a lot more than people would think. So, also a bit of an aside with Golos, you don't always go get Cataracts. Sometimes you automatically assume that this is going to die. So if you think that Golos isn't going to survive a turn, you don't get Cataracts. All right, you go get your one of your flexible lands, Mobilizing District, Crawling Barrens, more life gain with Radiant Fountain or Scavenger Grounds. But typically, that's what you're getting is Cataracts, so that you can start flipping Golos or spinning the wheel. And this also gets around Grafdigger's Cage, because the first part, it says exile the top 3 cards of your library. All right, it doesn't say cast them from your library. It just says exile them, and then you may play them. You're not casting them. That also gets around this. And then if they get exiled, you can also get them back with Karn. So everything in your deck gets back, or you can get it back with Karn. There is no other way to it sucks you can't get lands with it because it just says artifact card, not colorless. I'd imagine if this said colorless, that'd be insane. I'd probably be too good. But if you exile any artifact with anything and it's face up, then you can get it. All right. That means if you exile with the extinction event, whatever. All right. The matchups. Excuse me. So, the top 3 decks in the format goes as follows. I made a tier list. It's on my Twitter. If you want to find my Twitter, you can type in, if you're on Twitch, you can type in ! Twitter, and it'll bring you to my page. Or you can type in and search at capital A Azrael the Great One, and it'll bring you to my page. And also on the Twitch, I have a little link in the top right-hand corner of my About, where I have a Twitter page, a YouTube page, and then the TSN page, the 10th Street News page. And I'll probably post, I'm going to post that all the social media stuff on the description below. So check those. Each matchup, the top 3 decks in the format are as follows. The best aggro deck in the format and probably the best overall deck in the format right now is Goblins, and it's not even close. Goblins had the best weekend, and their win rate is over 60%, like 60.08 or something like that. And then the best control deck is Sultai or 4-color control, which is basically Sultai adding white for Mythos and Nethroi and Yasharn, Pig. And then the best mid-range deck is probably Rakdos, but Jund is not far behind. It just depends on the matchup, and we'll get into that here in a second. So, matchups. Sultai. This matchup really determines based on what list they have. If it's in the dark, like you don't know what Sultai list you're facing, I would say that you're right, slightly favored.
We're back.
Because most Sultai lists are not... All right. So, I'm actually going to cover up my slobs, and then I'm going to have the bitrate counter on here so that... Why do I keep pulling up Discord? That's not what I want. All right. All right. The most probably the hardest matchup of all 3, and that is the Goblins matchup. The Goblins matchup, I'm pretty sure that Goblins has there's only one matchup that Goblins has a bad matchup against, and I don't think that deck's good enough. So it has a good matchup against Sultai, and it has a good matchup against Jund, and a good matchup against Rakdos. So and I say good as in the win rate is over 50%. I think there's only like 1 or 2 lists or archetypes that Goblins has trouble with, and the only reason why it has trouble with it is because it's slanted in that perspective. But I don't think the decks are good enough, and that's blue-white, and any deck that's playing a lot of counter magic and a lot of sweepers, but those sweepers aren't good in the sense that they're not as good as they used to be. But anyways, Goblins. I wrote here that your favorite game 1, but I'm pretty sure that game 1 is even because they don't have a lot to that. Their game plan in game 1 is to combo you. If you stop that, they have ways to interact with you, but you can't really stop it from happening. And the reason why I think Goblins is so good is because whatever stops them from comboing or whatever stops them from getting the kill is basically they have it inside their deck and they can search for it. So like all the artifacts that stop them from what they're doing, basically they can just go get Trash Master because they play 1 main. with Matron, and then they don't even have to have goblins. Trashmaster can sack himself, or he can sacrifice himself to do the to sacrifice to destroy artifacts. So you just basically gotta hope that you've slowed the game down enough to, play your game, which is being as proactive as possible. Historic is all about how proactive can you be. It's not about how reactive. That's why the control decks are not very good. And that's why all of the proactive cards that say any target and creatures and all that. That's why Sultai is good. It's why Rakdos, Red, Black, X are good. Because their cards deal with a lot of the format, and they don't have to slant their deck in a way that takes away percentage points from other decks that they don't have to care about. And that's what we're doing here, except we have to slant percentage points against certain decks so much that the top three are what matter, because the top three is like 60-70% of the metagame. So that's why you're trying to target. Anyways. Goblins, you're basically even, and then game 2 and 3 it gets hard because they get more interaction for your cages, and they can just aggro you. They don't have to have Muxus, and Muxus is kind of like one of those, like if you've controlled the game enough, and then they just Muxus and kill you. So your cage plan is to stop them from Muxusing early. And then you leverage your way to get to Ugin and produce enough creatures that their creature plan doesn't work. It's not a full-fledged plan, but it's not a dog game. Like, you're not completely it's not a percentage game where you're like, oh man, I'm just like 90-10, I can't win this matchup. It's winnable, but you have to leverage your spots, and that's kind of like why Cry of the Carnarium is in, because it gets a lot of their stuff for cheap, and you don't have to really do much. You just basically turn 3 it when you have Cage, and you're fine. Cage is not as good in the post-board games because they get Herald's Horn, but you still need it because they don't bore out a Muxus, so you don't sideboard this out against Goblins. You basically side out your Ulamogs because you're never getting to 10 mana, and you're just boarding in Cry the Carnariums. You don't board in Thoughtseize because against aggro matchups, you don't want to take any more damage than you need to. And sometimes they go like some crazy like 1-drop into 2-drop into 3, and then they go Cranko and just kill you. So you have to be ready for that, and having Cries basically kill everything but their Muxus and their Krankos. And then Muxus and Cranko both have even converted mana cost, and so do the tokens. So this basically cleans up everything else that you can't get with Cry. So that's basically how it is. I might go to 3, but it really depends. And if I go to 3, I'm cutting Mystic Forge, and then I'll probably just cut Mystic Forge out, and then I'm playing something else. So, but that's where we are with that. And then the other third, so basically I have 2 good matchups against the top 3 decks. Goblins is not one of them. Jund and Rakdos Sacrifice are decent matchups, but it really hinges on what they're playing. So like I group these together because it's basically the same core plan. They leverage Cat Oven and then Mayhem Devil with all of their sacrifice stuff, but some play Trail of Crumbs, some don't. Some play Collected Company and some don't. Some play the just the full-fledged Rakdos Avenue with none of those cards. And then some play Corvold and some don't. So it really depends on what they're doing. The more aggro plans are a little harder because of one card, and that's Dreadhorde Butcher. Dreadhorde Butcher is annoying, and unless you have Extinction Event, that card gets really big really fast, and it deals a lot of damage. And that's what makes the Rakdos deck, specifically Rakdos Sacrifice, a hard matchup if they're playing Butcher. But I don't think Butcher is good enough across the format, so you don't see it often. But if you do, it just makes the matchup harder. You're slightly favored overall. You're favored if they're not playing the aggressive version and the only version that gives you a slightly unfavorable is the Dreadhorde Butcher plan with Collected Company. You have to draw well. The onus is on you drawing well. If you don't, then it's slightly unfavorable. The rest of them are favorable because you basically go over the top of them. Corvold draws more cards than you do, but they don't get to Corvold very easily. Sometimes they just miss land drops. So usually they're not powering that out fast enough. So, and then these are the popular matchups, by the way. Auras has becoming popular. And the way you, excuse me, before I move on, the way you sideboard against Rakdos and Jund is, again, Ulamog. You just cut Ulamog, bring in Cries, and you're fine. If they're more slanted towards, if they're playing the Corvold, like you don't care about they're playing Trail of Crumbs, they're playing Corvold, they're playing like a more grindy, like they don't need their graveyard as much, you can probably get away with cutting maybe a Cage because you don't need it as much, and you bring in something else to kind of leverage that. But I would just keep the Cage in because it stops the cat oven crap. And then you're just trying to get to Ugin. Once you resolve Ugin, the game's over. It's very rare that you lose a game where Ugin resolves and they can't kill it the turn that they untap. So, Auras. This is the nightmare matchup for you. And it doesn't matter what version. It doesn't matter if it's black, white, or blue, white. All right. And the reason why is because this deck has a very, very difficult problem, which is kind of why I went this route. This has a hard time with an aggro clock with disruption. And there's some contention of what that means. But basically, if they present enough disruption against you, but have a big enough clock, it's a nightmare matchup for you. So nightmare matchup being Auras, the vehicles matchup is annoying, and any blue tempo deck. So Simic Flash and Mono Blue Tempo produce enough of a clock and have enough disruption where it throws you off your game. You're hardly ever two-spelling them, and you can't get ahead. Those are the nightmare matchups for you. Luckily for you, Tempo decks and Auras, Tempo specifically is not very good, and it's not popular. So if you face it, you just take the L. It's fine. It's not a big deal. You seeing it once every 10 to 15 matches is fine, considering that your win rate overall is about 52 to 55%, depending on what the meta is. So you're fine taking a loss there. And that's on average. The Auras matchup, the reason why it's so difficult is because they present a ginormous clock that you have trouble dealing with, and they can rebuild fast, plus they have disruption. So the black version has Thoughtseize, and the blue version has Disdainful Strokes, Spell Pierce, and Dovin's Vetoes. So their disruption plan is very, very efficient while also keeping there's never a time where they tap out. If they tap out, it's because they have no counter magic, obviously. Or because none of their creatures matter. You don't care if they give it indestructibility. You don't care if they give it protection or none of that because you're playing Extinction Event and Cry the Current Areas. You're not playing spot removal. So you don't care about that. That's why you side out Ugin against them. Or not Ugin, but Ulamog. Ulamog, you sometimes get to 10 mana, but you can target their flyer and then they just give it hexproof, and now you're just standing there with a 12/12 that can actually be raced by the Auras deck. So the matchup is you're a heavy underdog against them. Game 1 is slightly unfavorable because they don't have as much counter magic against you. Game 2 and 3 is just difficult. And it doesn't matter. You can try bringing in Thoughtseize, but I got nothing because the matchup is so difficult. You need the cages, although I probably side them out because you don't need them in the early game. You just need them at specific times. So you can probably get away with cutting these and then bringing in like 2 Thoughtseize to kind of like hedge your bets to get their disruption out. Against black white, you don't want to because if they're playing Thoughtseize, they're casting them, so you don't really need these. And making them discard creatures when they get back Lurrus just doesn't matter. Stay tuned for more matchups on this playlist to see how the matchup is played, how it's sideboarded, and the intricacies of each one. If you like the content, please like and subscribe, while also checking out the other social media outlets in the description below.